Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 14 about checking the power of the court. In this lesson, you'll learn about statutory revision, constitutional amendments, non-enforcement, transformative appointments, and borking. I'm sure you're wondering what that is. Okay, so the main question we're going to be talking about in this lesson is whether or not the Supreme Court's power to interpret the Constitution or laws as they see fit, what we've called judicial activism before, can be checked, or in other words, somehow controlled by somebody else, or can they basically just get away with anything they want? And we're going to consider that question by thinking of a hypothetical circumstance in which the Supreme Court intentionally misinterprets a statute. And other people out in society look what the Supreme Court did and say, wow, the Supreme Court read that law completely wrong, maybe even backwards from what it actually means. Which, believe it or not, I'm not going to go into details of this in this lesson, the Supreme Court has actually done that before. They have claimed that a law means something that if you look at the plain words of the law, it seems to mean the exact opposite. So let's imagine the Supreme Court has done that. Question is, what can be done to stop them, to somehow reverse what they had done? And we're going to look at 4 possibilities. The first of those is statutory revision. Now, that word statute is another way of saying law, so we're talking about revising the law. So the Supreme Court got a law, they read it wrong, now what we're going to do is we're going to try to rewrite the law to get them to do it right. So the question is, can we pass a new law to counteract the activism of the Supreme Court? Well, if we do pass a law, essentially rewrite the statute that they got wrong to try to make it clear to them, oh, no, this is what we actually meant. Yeah, we wrote it before and you misinterpreted it. Now we're going to write it again to make sure you get it right this time. Well, if we do that, who will be interpreting that rewritten statute? It'll be the same court that misinterpreted the original one. And so if they got the original one wrong, what makes you think that they're going to get the second one right? If they intentionally misread the first one to get an outcome that they wanted, which is what judicial activism is, wouldn't they just intentionally misread the second one too, to again get the outcome that they wanted? Of course you would think they would. As a matter of fact, here's an example of a Supreme Court justice, kind of shockingly, admitting that that's the kind of thing that they do. This is Justice John Paul Stevens. And in this case, you don't need to know the details of what this case is about or what he's specifically talking about, but notice what he says here. He says here that he has a choice between an authoritative construction of an act. In other words, how the Supreme Court has chosen to interpret a certain law. That's what on one side that he has a choice of. Or that's at odds with what he understands to be the actual intent of the people that wrote the law. So the Supreme Court has written this law to mean, interpreted this law to mean X, even though John Paul Stevens, a member of the Supreme Court, knows that the people that wrote the law intended it to mean Y. He knows the Supreme Court got it wrong. So which is he going to choose? He says, I conclude without hesitation that I must answer the question in the affirmative. Now notice, before he said, my only problem is whether or not I should adhere to that authority, in other words, stick with the Supreme Court's misinterpretation or go to this thing that I understand to be the correct answer. He says, I'm going to stick with the Supreme Court's misinterpretation. Wow. You got a Supreme Court justice admitting that he's voting for the wrong answer. Why? Well, we already explained why in the previous lesson. It's a way of protecting the Supreme Court's reputation. Okay, so let's try a second way. The first way isn't going to work because if we simply rewrite the law, they'll just simply intentionally misinterpret the new law also. So how about we amend the Constitution instead? What we're going to do is we're going to pass a constitutional amendment that will force the Supreme Court to read the law correctly. Will that work? Well, the first big problem, as we learned much earlier in this course, it's really hard to amend the Constitution. So the idea of passing a constitutional amendment to correct a misinterpretation by the Supreme Court is a dubious idea. It's kind of doubtful you're going to be able to get a constitutional amendment through just to do that. But let's imagine you did. You managed to get a constitutional amendment passed to correct the Supreme Court's misinterpretation of the law originally at question in this hypothetical. Well, who will interpret that new amendment? In other words, decide what it really means and what it does. It'll be the same court that misinterpreted the law in the first place. Now, are they going to interpret this new amendment as disallowing the interpretation that they already had before that they wanted? Of course not. They'll interpret this new amendment as allowing them to keep the law the way they wanted it. They have the power to do it. Why wouldn't they? So if it doesn't do any good to change the law, it doesn't do any good to pass a constitutional amendment to correct the Supreme Court. How about non-enforcement? Now, what we mean by that is, what if we just ignore the Supreme Court's decision? Now, the reason I call that non-enforcement is, remember, the Supreme Court doesn't have a police force, it doesn't have money, it cannot hire people to force anyone to obey its rulings. The only way it gets anybody to obey its rulings is everyone looks at their rulings and says, oh, I guess that's right, and then they're the ones that get the police to enforce it. They're the ones that get the president to enforce it, the whatever, okay? It's other people actually enforcing what they're doing, not themselves. They've just got to convince people somehow to obey them. So what if we just simply say, no, we're not going to obey that. You got it wrong, Supreme Court. We're just going to ignore what you said and go do our own thing. Will that work? Well, we've got a pretty startling example from fairly recent, in the big history of the United States of America. We're talking about within the past 50 years. Recent political situation where it pitted a powerful political figure against the Supreme Court. And the question was, could this powerful political figure get away with disobeying the court? That powerful political figure was Richard Nixon. We don't want to go into the details of the Watergate controversy. We've actually talked about him earlier in the course a little bit in the unit on the presidency. But for right now, just remember that President Nixon got in trouble when his campaign broke into his opponent's headquarters. He didn't know about it at the time, but he chose to then try to cover up his connection to it when he found out that it was his campaign workers who had done this. So what he did then was, as he's covering this up, eventually the people start to catch on to what may have been happening. And it's discovered that he recorded conversations in his office. And so the prosecutors that are trying to figure out what's really going on here, they want the tapes to try to figure out what his role was in this, among other things, and he refused to turn the tapes over. Well, eventually the Supreme Court ruled against him and said, you have to turn the tapes over. Well, what did the president do then? Turning them over essentially guarantees that he's going to be found out, that he's going to be impeached, he's going to be kicked out of the presidency. But what does he do when the Supreme Court orders him to do it? Notice here in this headline, he pledges to comply, and he did. He eventually turned the tapes over. And the result of all of this was not that he got impeached, but that he resigned from office. So he had big incentives to try to disobey the court, but he didn't dare. Why would he not dare to disobey the Supreme Court? Because if he did, he would be seen as the lawless one. He would be seen as the criminal, because we have so much faith that we build up and trust that we build up in the Supreme Court that if they say somebody else is behaving badly, we say, well, I guess that other person's behaving badly. So that precludes anyone from just outright disobeying the Supreme Court, even if the Supreme Court is the one that got it wrong. Okay, so statutory revision isn't going to work, constitutional amendments aren't going to work, non-enforcement's not going to work. How about we try what we call a transformative appointment? What we mean by that is maybe we can appoint some new judges to the Supreme Court who will not be activists and not abuse their power. How about that? Well, it's been tried. When Ronald Reagan was president, in 1987, he appointed a man named Robert Bork to the United States Supreme Court. Robert Bork was a person who was pledged to not be an activist judge. And he was probably the most qualified nominee in Supreme Court history. Here's his qualifications. Before being nominated to the Supreme Court, he was serving as a circuit court judge. That's the level of courts right below the Supreme Court. Before that, he had been Solicitor General of the United States. That is the chief lawyer for the United States of America. Before that, he had been the acting Attorney General of the United States of America. That's the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America. And he had also been a professor at Yale Law School, the #1 law school in the world. You cannot get a better resume than that to serve on the United States Supreme Court. Yet despite that, when the Senate voted on him, they defeated him 42-58. What? How? How do they vote against the most qualified nominee ever? Well, the answer is, as you can see in this quote from the United States Senator, there are some people who prefer activist judges. And the reason they prefer activist judges is those people can get them things that otherwise they can't get. Maybe they can't win votes in the individual states to get same-sex marriage passed, but they can get the Supreme Court to declare a right to same-sex marriage for the entire country, as an example. So there are people out there who want to have activist judges on the Supreme Court. And when they look at someone like Robert Bork, who pledged not to be an activist judge, they see him as an enemy to them accomplishing what they want. So they're going to vote against him. And it's not just outsiders accusing of this. People on the inside will even admit that this is what is going on. The time that Robert Bork was nominated, we have a former Assistant Secretary of State to Jimmy Carter, Democratic president. This is a Democratic politician, a liberal politician, who said that, I got to admit that's what's going on here. We've become dependent on the least democratic institutions, talking about the Supreme Court, to give us what we can't win at the ballot box, and that's why we have to stop somebody like Robert Bork from getting on the court, because he wouldn't give us anymore what it is that we want from the judges. So, the reason that Robert Bork was opposed was because some people want activist judges, and he wasn't going to be that. Now, they got enough of them out there to actually defeat him even. The reason that some people want activist judges, we can see back from, we had this slide previously in the lesson about interest groups and about how sometimes they sue. And at the time, the point that I made was that lawsuits to change society tend to be brought by ideological liberals. And the reason is really easy to understand. Way back when we talked about ideology at the beginning of this course, it was explained that basic idea of liberals is they want to change things for the better. Basic idea of conservatives is they want to preserve or keep the good things that they're afraid are going to be destroyed. So people that are going out trying to change society are probably more likely to be liberals. And so the ones going to court to change society are probably going to be liberals. Well, what kind of judges do they want in place if they're trying to change things? They want activist judges. And so a judge like Robert Bork would get in the way of what they're trying to accomplish through the courts. And so they would organize to stop him. So how did they manage to stop him, even though he was so overwhelmingly qualified? They did it first by being highly organized. Here's just one example. One of these liberal groups called People for the American Way, you can see here, mailed out thousands of letters to newspapers. And to millions of letters out to people across the United States of America, trying to convince them that Robert Bork was a bad guy. People on this side also got and gave speeches that exaggerated the danger of Robert Bork. Here's the most famous one, delivered by Senator Ed Kennedy from Massachusetts. I should say Ted Kennedy, that's what he liked to be called. Anyway, Senator Kennedy said, Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions. Blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters. Rogue police would kick down citizens' doors. And midnight. He's trying to make Robert Bork sound like a really scary, evil person. But the groups that were opposed to him even went beyond that. They would sometimes tell outright lies. Like, for example, some ads put out by Planned Parenthood Corporation claimed that Robert Bork had ruled against a grandmother in a decision that would be heart-wrenching. Well, it turned out that he wasn't even a judge when that decision was made. He had no part of it. He'd never written about it, never discussed it. It was an outright lie to claim that he was the person behind it. But they ran advertisements to that effect to make him look bad. Well, this organized campaign to defeat Robert Bork, because he was not an activist that would keep their agenda going of getting wins in the Supreme Court for the things they wanted, was so effective that he was defeated. And it was so effective that a new word entered the English language. That word is borking. Borking refers to systematically using emotional arguments, exaggerations, even lies to defeat somebody that's been nominated to some position. Look it up in the dictionary. It's there now. Borking, named after him. And this is something that is done sometimes in politics now to defeat people. It's particularly done concerning judges, and it's particularly done with people from the political left, the liberals, because they're the ones that are most concerned about getting the right sort of judges on the court to keep their agenda of change moving forward. They don't want judges who are not activists getting in their way. All right, so let's review what we learned in this lesson. Why will statutory revision not stop judicial activism? Is it because new laws can't change old laws? Is it because no, you can't have any two laws on the same subject? Is it because the court will not review the new laws? Or is it because the new laws will be interpreted by the same court that interpreted the old ones? It's that last one. If the court misinterpreted a law before and you pass a new one to fix it, they'll just misinterpret the new one too. Why will a new amendment not stop judicial activism? Is it because amendments can't actually change laws? Is it because an amendment can't be on the same subject as a law? Is it because such amendments aren't allowed? Or is it because amendments will be interpreted by the same court that misinterpreted the law? That's that last one. Again, if the court's going to misinterpret the law, they'll misinterpret the constitutional amendment too, to accomplish what they want. Why can't we disobey activist court decisions? Is it because judicial review is in the Constitution? Is it because we would be viewed as lawless then for disobeying the court? Is it because it's constitutionally prohibited that we are forbidden from disobeying the court? Or is it because the Supreme Court has police to make us obey? We can't disobey the court because then we'd be viewed as the people acting lawlessly, not the court. What is a transformative appointment? Is it an appointment that will then somehow change the attitude and direction of the court? Or is it a delayed nomination? Or is it a president changing his mind about who he's appointing? Or is it a nominee who's already been rejected by the Senate? A transformative appointment will change the attitude or direction of the court. That's what a transformative appointment will do. It will send it off in different areas. That's why the people who oppose it, because they don't want the court to be changed. They want the court to remain the activist court that they want. What is borking? Is it switching nominees? Is it saying exaggerations to defeat a nominee? Is it a nominee lying about his views? Or is it the Senate debating a nominee? Borking is exaggerations that are said to defeat a nominee. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 7. It'll be the final lesson of Unit 7, Lesson 15, about judicial restraint.